The Intel socket 1151 is one of the easier sockets to put a CPU into and take a CPU out of. However, the stock Clicky Leg heatsink is kind of a pain in the neck. I'm going to show you both of these. So let me go through the process of removing this heatsink and the CPU from an Intel LGA 1151 socket. I commonly call this the clicky heatsink because the four legs click through holes in the motherboard and there's some spreaders that lock it into place on the other side. So the first thing I need to do is unplug the computer and turn it off, which I've already done. Now I'm going to connect my static strap that I have on my wrist, and then I can start working. So I need to unlock these legs. Right now they're in the lock position. If you look at this leg, that notch that you would put a straight edge screwdriver into is on a line that goes right through the middle of the heatsink. That's locked. If I turn it 90 degrees counterclockwise, it is unlocked. Now, in many cases, you can just turn these by hand. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn these by hand, but if you have any trouble, use a straight edge screwdriver. Now I've got all four turned to unlock, and what I need to do now is pull them up out of the holes in the motherboard. So I'm just going to pull up, and they're going to slide up, in which that's going to release them. Next thing you want to do is wiggle the heatsink some to make sure the heatsink compound has not glued onto the top of the CPU. And it's loose, so now I can start pulling the heatsink up. And I may need to pull on these legs a little bit to get them to completely come out of the holes. It's out of the holes on the motherboard. You can see the heatsink compound. And I can unplug the fan head from the motherboard. And you can see this is a 4-pin fan head. It's got 4 wires going into it. The other thing you can see is this leg has a plunger in the middle of it. When I click that down, do you see how that black comes all the way through and makes the two white parts of the plunger spread out? That's what locks it onto the bottom of the motherboard. So this is unlocked and that's locked. Now, if you have it turned to the unlocked position when you push that in, it'll just pop back out and it will not stay in the motherboard. Let's get this out of the way and let's go on to the CPU. So this is an LGA 1151, and the first thing I want you to notice is this metal, this triangle embedded in the metal of the cover plate. This is going to correspond to a triangle on the CPU chip to tell us which way to put it on. Now to unlock this cover plate, I got to push down on this handle, pull out, and then let it up. Then I can push a little further and the cover plate will come up. Now you notice it's going underneath this lug. That's what's locking it in place. I'm going to pull it up, flip it out of the way. Now I can see the CPU chip, and the only thing that's holding it in there is gravity. But if you look right there, there is the triangle I was speaking of that gets our alignment correctly. Now a lot of motherboards, the better motherboards, actually have a white L shape right here or a white triangle painted onto the motherboard to also help you get it aligned. Now to pull the CPU out, I've got to kind of grab it on both edges. Sometimes you've got to use 2 hands to get a hold of it. And whatever you do when you get it out, do not drop it into that heatsink. If one of the corners of this CPU was to fall into that socket, it would damage the socket, you would ruin the motherboard, and you would have a piece of art you could frame and put on the wall, but it would no longer be a computing device. So now I've got the CPU out. If we look on the bottom of it, you'll see the lands. These are just bumps that make contacts with the legs in the socket, and these legs are very fragile. So if you do not have a CPU in the socket, there is a plastic cover plate that you want to put back on top of this metal cover plate to protect those pins. Or you want to leave the CPU in the socket. Now, one other detail I want to show you is there's 2 little notches missing from the CPU here, and there's 2 little plastic notches in this socket. That's another way to know you've got it the right way. So this heatsink compound looks really good. We have a good amount of heatsink compound on both of these. I'm not going to wipe it off and clean it and reapply. I'm just going to put the CPU back into the socket. I've got my triangle the correct way. Remember, we have the triangle right here for the socket, so the triangle, I've got it the correct way. Let me get the load plate out of the way, and I'm just going to gently place that CPU back in the socket. It's all the way down. Now I can bring the load plate down, make sure it's underneath the lug, and then bring my lever all the way down and out and underneath. Okay, now it's locked in place. Now I've got to reinstall my heatsink. So the first thing you've got to do to reinstall the heatsink is turn the legs back to the lock position. So that slot is on a line going through the middle of the heatsink. So I did that for 1, 2, let me get all 4 of these turned back to lock. Okay, I've got all 4 of them turned back to lock. Now the holes in the motherboard are perfectly square, so it doesn't matter which way I put the heatsink on. I think I'm going to put it on this way because it's going to work best for the fan head. Now I'm going to maneuver it down, wiggle it until the legs start going through the holes on the motherboard, and then I'm going to click these into place. You hear that loud audible click, and then you go around the horn and push on them again, and you can push quite hard. The motherboard's going to bend some. It's not going to damage the motherboard. And then the last thing I need to do is plug the fan head back into the motherboard CPU fan head. There, got it. I've got the fan connected, everything's reconnected. The last thing you have to do is look on the back of the motherboard and make sure that those legs are fully engaged. And I'm shooting just a little bit more video after this to show you that. All right, I've got my camera readjusted. I've got the computer case standing up, and the case has an opening on the back panel so I can see the back of the motherboard. And this is the load plate that the CPU, that cover plate locks onto. Here are the 4 legs that are sticking out through the holes in the motherboard for the heatsink. And if you look carefully, you can see the black insert on the inside of the 2 white plastic clips. And when you click that down, that makes those clips spread out and locks it into place. If you don't see that black as far out as the white clips, you do not have that leg plugged in all the way. So it's good to do a visual verification that you have those legs all the way through the motherboard. Now the Clicky heatsink is my least favorite heatsink. It's kind of fiddly, and the legs will wear out if you take the heatsink in and out over and over again like we do in a PC hardware class. Personally, if I bought an Intel CPU that came with a Clicky Leg heatsink, I would buy a third-party heatsink for $25 or $30, maybe $40, and use that instead of the Intel stock heatsink.